Hello. So for this video for West Virginia Day 2024, we're going to be talking about Josh Oster's book, Tales from the Limestone. Now this is a pretty new collection of poetry, published in 2023 by Ellerslie Books, in case you're interested. It's an interesting collection because it's definitely a contemporary take on growing up in West Virginia and what it means to be a West Virginian today in the 21st century. Oster is from Martinsburg, West Virginia. That's where he grew up. And so that's sort of the core of this experience. But he's also quite well traveled. He's a musician. He's lived abroad in Ireland and possibly other places. And so he's got that external lens he can bring to life in West Virginia in addition to the experiences of being a West Virginian. And you can see those two different components to his writing in the poems. This awareness of life in West Virginia and sort of what it means to live in West Virginia, but at the same time, this external lens that lends itself to criticism of the state and of West Virginia's culture. So I'm going to read you a few of the poems that I think sort of represent this. We start with Poverty in a Small Town. Elegant graffiti litters October air, frost-laden actions from a passerby create friction on the streets. Another lonely vagabond with a cart of aluminum wounds views the world in dotted lines with no sense of how to connect them. The next one I'm going to read you is called Hitchhiking. And this is another sort of one that's very critical of the culture of poverty that remains central to Appalachia in general. So, Hitchhiking. The poverty-stricken man stuck out his thumb along the Appalachian Highway, where beggar's lice made its way along silver guardrail and asphalt. He held the book of Revelation in his hands, read 1612, down the waterway, driftwood on the other side of the guardrail prepared for war. A passing semi up ahead barks, its presence known. CB radio lingo becomes a poetic form of its own. A poverty-stricken man once stuck out his thumb along the Appalachian Highway, who made his way past the boughs of dogwood trees, wished he had never traveled alone. But then we've got these ones, these poems that very directly sort of identify the losses and limitations of West Virginia life, of living in a state with high poverty rates, with few job opportunities, things like this. And some of the poems actually take quite a funny turn on this. They have a clear sense of humor about this situation. So there are these poems like Hitchhiking, like Poverty in a Small Town, where the poverty is really the focus, and we have this sort of social critique aspect. But then there are also, again, these poems that deal with that poverty, but deal with it not so much as tragedy, although it is still seen as negative, but bring a sense of humor to it and acknowledge the ways in which generations and generations and generations of poverty and economic struggle have tended to make people in West Virginia more resilient. So there's this one, for instance. You had me at hell. Sometimes I get the feeling that it would be easier to be less of a pessimist when your light needs AAA batteries. Damn, I only have a 9-volt. So there's some sort of fun humor in some of these. But then there's also poems that take a much more defiant tone and encourage readers to sort of challenge the perspective of Appalachia as impoverished, as sort of almost second-class citizens and things like this. So we get this, for instance, in the poem Classroom. You chose to be here. Knowing your voice is the difference between a future and a pipeline prison that they've made you that they've been made to believe exists. Help them defy it. So again, we have that sort of that resistance to the popular narrative about West Virginia, the challenge to the way that people typically look at Appalachia, look at West Virginia, this idea of, right, the sort of illiterate hillbilly and things like this, these old damaging stereotypes. And yet, in a state that has very high poverty rates, the school to prison pipeline is not a fiction. It's not something that is made up or that does not genuinely exist. It does exist because there's so little economic opportunity. Another type of poem that you have here is poems about West Virginia that are celebratory in some ways. I mean, even the poems that are negative, that present these uncomfortable pictures, these critiques of West Virginia, but you've got poems that are also celebratory, and I would put Mountaineer Eulogy into that category. So this is the next one I'm going to read for you, Mountaineer Eulogy. I'm from places of needlepoint relapses, places where my good friends struggle. I'm from places where a 20 is the difference from an empty tank or a full stomach. I'm from every pothole in 495 south to 270 to 81. Until they're fixed, we'll go nowhere. So again, there's that kind of defiance at the end there, the last two lines, until they're fixed, we'll go nowhere. And this is one of the things, right, is you see this in so much West Virginia literature, so much West Virginia writing and culture and music and things like this. This dedication to place, to West Virginia, to being in West Virginia and remaining in West Virginia, even when there's no jobs, even when there are huge issues with drug use, even when name your social problem exists. There is this dedication to remaining in West Virginia, to being rooted in place. And again, that's a thing that I've really not seen from other regions in the U.S., other states. It's not something that I've seen from other people other than West Virginians in the U.S. So it's a very pervasive, consistent element of West Virginia culture. So the last thing I want to talk about with Tales from the Limestone is that there are poems that just don't really have much overtly to do with West Virginia at all. Because Oster is not just a West Virginian, he's not a sort of simplistic one-trick pony. He also has poems that are more general, or poems about his experiences as a musician. And those ones haven't spoken to me quite as much because it's not something that I'm tremendously interested in. But there's one of his more general poems that I really, really did like. Some of you will know that I have a cat named Frank, who's one of my favorite beings in the world. So the first poem actually in the collection is called Calico. I love cat poems, by the way. So this is Calico. The shadows of a calico on the deck, homeless wanderer, she nestles against the stone-cold steps of the veranda during a thunderstorm. Odd, it seems, how life is measured by the lead in your words, the poison in your veins to scream at passing clouds. Yet the calico will still rest her head in your lap. So, again, I think this is a very interesting and engaging contemporary voice in Appalachian writing. And we see a lot of the same kinds of things that I think are becoming the hallmarks of contemporary Appalachian writing, contemporary West Virginia writing, critiques of the state itself while maintaining this sort of fidelity to the state. The state remains the location for the poet persona, even as the poet persona acknowledges all of the problems, acknowledges all of the challenges, the culture of poverty, and so on and so on. And I think Oster is doing these kinds of things in his work, and I think it's really working quite well.